I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get involved in neighborhood drama. All I wanted was a peaceful existence on my little slice of suburban paradise. The natural spring that flowed through my backyard was precisely why I purchased this property 3 years ago. There's something meditative about the gentle babbling of water over stones that makes even the most stressful workday fade away. So imagine my shock when I arrived home one Tuesday afternoon to find a crew of workers standing at the edge of my property, examining my spring with surveying equipment. One man was already placing markers along the water's edge, while another was unfolding what looked suspiciously like diversion plans. I'd love to know where you're watching this story from. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to deal with nosy neighbors trying to claim what's rightfully yours. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anger bubbling up inside me. "What exactly is going on here?" The workers looked up, momentarily startled by my presence, but before any of them could respond, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and the unmistakable air of entitlement strode across my lawn as if she owned it. This was my first real encounter with Karen Miller, the recently elected HOA president of our Whispering Pines community. I'd seen her at a distance during neighborhood gatherings, always holding court with her small circle of admirers. But we'd never directly interacted. Now, she was standing on my property, clipboard in hand, looking at my spring as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a natural treasure to be preserved. "Sebastian, just the person I wanted to see," Karen exclaimed with a saccharine smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm so glad we caught you. We're planning some wonderful improvements to our neighborhood aesthetics. Your little stream here would look so much more appealing if it flowed through properly landscaped areas. I've drawn up plans to redirect it through my property, where I'll be installing a stunning water garden that everyone can enjoy when they pass by." The casual way she announced her intentions to steal my water source left me momentarily speechless. She continued without pausing, gesturing expansively as if painting her vision in the air. "The HOA board agrees that having the water feature visible from the main road will increase property values throughout Whispering Pines. Currently, it's wasted back here where nobody can appreciate it." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm and rational. "Karen, this spring is on my property. It's part of why I bought this house. I'm afraid I can't agree to redirecting it." I spoke firmly but politely, hoping that would be the end of it. I should have known better. Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she composed herself again, her voice taking on an edge I would soon become very familiar with. "Sebastian, as HOA president, I need to consider what's best for the entire community, not just one homeowner. The board has already approved this beautification project. We're not asking for your permission. I'm merely informing you as a courtesy." The workers glanced uncomfortably between us, clearly sensing the tension. I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest. "Actually, Karen, you do need my permission. The water rights for this spring were explicitly included in my property deed. You and the HOA have no authority to redirect water from my land without my consent. I'd like these men off my property now, please." I could see the flash of anger in her eyes, quickly masked by a thin veneer of professional concern. Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence, though her tone was unmistakably threatening. "Listen, Sebastian, I don't think you understand how things work here. The HOA has broad authority over exterior modifications and community resources. Fighting this will only make your life difficult. Why not be a team player?" I maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. "I understand perfectly how things work, including property law. This conversation is over. Please leave my property." I turned to the workers. "Gentlemen, I'm not authorizing any work here. If you continue, I'll be forced to call the police for trespassing." The men looked to Karen, who was practically vibrating with suppressed rage. With a tight smile, she gestured for them to pack up. As they gathered their equipment, she turned back to me. "This isn't over, Sebastian. I'm the HOA president, and if you think you can obstruct community improvements, you'll find that being uncooperative comes with consequences. We'll discuss this at the next board meeting. I suggest you prepare yourself." As I watched Karen march back across the lawn, her back rigid with indignation, a cold determination settled over me. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I might prefer a quiet life, but I was not someone who would roll over and let an entitled neighbor steal what was rightfully mine. "Game on, Karen," I whispered to myself as the spring burbled peacefully behind me, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing over its fate. Little did she know, her insistence on having water flow through her property would soon come with consequences of its own. The next morning, I decided to arm myself with information. I pulled out my HOA documents, the stack of papers I'd skimmed when purchasing the house but hadn't looked at since. I spent hours parsing through the dense legalese, looking for anything related to water rights or community resources, as Karen had put it. What I found was reassuring. While the HOA did have broad authority over aesthetic issues like paint, colors, and lawn maintenance, there was nothing that would give them control over a natural water feature that was clearly within my property lines. Moreover, my deed specifically included riparian rights to the spring. I scanned these relevant documents and emailed them to myself, a precaution that would prove valuable later. Throughout the day, I received messages from a few neighbors. Most were carefully worded expressions of sympathy coupled with gentle advice to not rock the boat with Karen. Reading between the lines, I understood that many in the neighborhood feared her influence. Tom Jensen, who lived 2 doors down, was more direct. "Watch your back, Sebastian. Karen got the Richardsons fined $500 last year for having the wrong shade of beige on their garden shed. When they fought it, suddenly they were getting citations for everything from improper trash can storage to unapproved bird feeders. They ended up moving." This pattern of petty tyranny was concerning, but it also told me something important. Karen was used to getting her way through intimidation rather than actual authority. 3 days later, an official-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a notice for an emergency HOA meeting to discuss water feature redistribution for community enhancement, Karen's euphemism for stealing my spring. The meeting was scheduled for just 5 days later, barely meeting the minimum notice requirement in the HOA bylaws. This was clearly a tactical move to give me minimal time to prepare. Attached was a document outlining alleged violations of community standards on my property, including improper water management and obstruction of shared natural resources. Each accusation was more ridiculous than the last, twisting HOA rules to make it sound like my spring was somehow a problem I'd created, rather than a natural feature that had existed long before any of our homes were built. I spent the next few days gathering evidence and preparing my case. I researched local water rights laws, took extensive photos documenting exactly where the spring was located on my property, and even contacted a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. His advice was straightforward. You're on solid legal ground, but HOA boards can make homeowners' lives miserable even when they're wrong. Document everything, record the meeting if state law allows, and be prepared for this to potentially escalate. I also spoke with a few more neighbors, carefully feeling out who might be allies. Most seemed sympathetic but fearful. Only one elderly couple, the Mitchells, who had lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA was established, promised to attend the meeting and speak on my behalf if needed. The night before the meeting, I received another text from Tom. "Karen's been going door to door all day, showing everyone pictures of some fancy water garden she's planning, claiming it'll raise property values by 15%. Just thought you should know." I thanked him for the information, my suspicions confirmed. This wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics at all. It was about Karen wanting a fancy water feature for her own property without having to pay for it. She was using her position as HOA president to appropriate my natural resource for her personal benefit, disguising her self-interest as community improvement. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But anger wouldn't win this battle. I needed to remain calm, focused, and smarter than Karen anticipated. As I organized my documents and prepared my statement for the meeting, I considered my options. Fighting the HOA directly could be a long, costly battle, even if I was in the right. Karen clearly had the board in her pocket and wasn't above using HOA regulations as weapons. I needed a strategy that would both protect my rights and discourage Karen from continuing her campaign against me. An idea began to form, one that would use Karen's own greed and entitlement against her. If she wanted water flowing through her property so badly, perhaps I could accommodate her request in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Be careful what you wish for, Karen," I muttered to myself as I finalized my plans. The spring gurgled in agreement, as if it too was anticipating the showdown to come. The community center was more crowded than I'd expected when I arrived for the HOA meeting. Word had clearly spread about the conflict, drawing curious neighbors who normally skipped these bureaucratic gatherings. Karen sat at the center of a long table at the front of the room, flanked by 4 other board members who all seemed to be carefully avoiding eye contact with me as I took a seat in the front row. The room had the tense atmosphere of a minor courtroom, with hushed conversation stopping abruptly as Karen called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. "Welcome, everyone. We have several important matters to discuss tonight, but we'll begin with the issue of water redistribution for community enhancement." Her gaze fixed on me with barely concealed hostility. "As many of you know, there's a natural spring currently flowing through Sebastian Porter's backyard, where it remains hidden from community enjoyment. The board has developed a proposal to redirect this water feature to create a beautiful community garden area, visible from Maple Drive." Karen gestured to a large tripod beside her, flipping over the cover to reveal architectural renderings of an elaborate Japanese-inspired garden, complete with a meandering stream, decorative bridge, and what appeared to be a koi pond. "This enhancement project will create a stunning focal point for our neighborhood, substantially increasing property values and community prestige." Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the audience as Karen continued, her voice taking on a tone of regretful disapproval. "Unfortunately, Mr. Porter has been resistant to this improvement. Despite the clear community benefit, he seems determined to keep this natural resource for his private use only." She turned to me with a smile that could cut glass. "Perhaps you'd like to explain your position to your neighbors, Sebastian." I stood slowly, my prepared documents in hand, and walked to the small podium set up for resident comments. "Good evening, everyone. I appreciate the chance to address this issue directly." I kept my voice calm and professional, making eye contact with various neighbors rather than focusing on Karen's glare. "First, I'd like to clarify some factual matters. The spring that Karen is discussing is not a community resource. It is entirely located within my property boundaries, as confirmed by the county surveyor's office. I displayed the property survey on the projector I'd requested beforehand. Furthermore, my deed explicitly includes the water rights to this spring, which was a significant factor in my decision to purchase the home. I placed my deed on the projector next, highlighting the relevant section. While I understand the appeal of a community water feature, there are several practical issues that haven't been addressed in this proposal. I continued methodically, presenting facts rather than emotions. First, redirecting a natural spring isn't as simple as digging a new channel. It requires environmental impact studies and permits from the County Water Authority, none of which have been obtained. Second, the ongoing maintenance costs for such an elaborate water garden haven't been included in the HOA budget projections. Who will be responsible for these expenses? I paused, letting the practical concerns sink in. Finally, I'd like to point out that there is nothing in our HOA covenants that grants the association authority over natural water features on private property. I've reviewed the documents thoroughly. Karen's face had grown increasingly flushed as I spoke. Before I could continue, she interrupted. "This isn't about technicality, Sebastian. It's about what's best for the community as a whole, your private enjoyment versus increased property values for everyone. Surely you can see which takes priority." Her voice had taken on a condescending tone, as if explaining something obvious to a particularly dim child. I maintained my composure, though my grip on my papers tightened slightly. "Actually, Karen, property rights aren't technicalities, they're legally binding. But if the community truly desires a water feature, there are alternatives that don't involve appropriating my property. For instance, the HOA could install a fountain in the community park, or individual homeowners who want water features could install them at their own expense. The meeting devolved from there, with Karen attempting to frame me as selfish and obstructionist, while I continued presenting facts and legal realities. The other board members remained largely silent, occasionally nodding along with Karen, but offering no substantive comments of their own. When Karen finally called for a board vote on the proposal, I wasn't surprised to see it pass 5-0. "The board has approved the water feature redistribution project," Karen announced triumphantly. "Sebastian, you'll be receiving formal notification of required compliance within the week." Her smile was all victory and venom. I gathered my documents calmly, aware of the neighbors watching. "I understand the board's decision," I said evenly. "I'll wait for the formal notification to determine my next steps." As the meeting moved on to other business, I quietly exited the building. In the parking lot, several neighbors approached me with awkward expressions of sympathy. "That was rough in there," said Mrs. Mitchell, patting my arm. "Karen's gone too far this time. That spring is clearly on your property." I thanked her for her support, but my mind was already racing ahead. The HOA board might have voted in Karen's favor, but they had no legal authority to force me to redirect the spring. They could try to fine me for non-compliance, but that would open the door to a legal challenge that could potentially invalidate other HOA overreaches. I suspected Karen knew this, which meant her next move would likely involve more pressure tactics rather than legal enforcement. As I drove home, a plan began to crystallize in my mind. Karen wanted the spring water to flow through her property for her elaborate garden. What if, instead of fighting that desire directly, I found a way to give her exactly what she wanted, but in a way she would quickly regret? The HOA might have voted to redistribute the water, but they hadn't specified exactly how that redistribution should occur or how much water should be involved. Perhaps it was time to be cooperative in the most maliciously compliant way possible. A smile spread across my face as I pulled into my driveway. Karen thought she'd won tonight, but the real game was just beginning. The formal notification arrived in my mailbox 2 days later, a thick envelope containing a multi-page document with official HOA letterhead. It detailed the board's decision to redistribute the natural water resource for community enhancement and required me to cooperate with approved contractors to facilitate water flow redirection within 30 days. Buried in the dense paragraphs was the key phrase I'd been looking for. Homeowner must ensure unimpeded water flow from the natural spring to designated community enhancement area adjacent to Maple Drive. Nothing in the document specified how much water should flow, only that it must flow unimpeded. This vague wording was exactly the loophole I needed. I spent the weekend researching hydraulics and consulting with a friend who worked in civil engineering. Together, we designed a system that would technically comply with the HOA's requirements while ensuring Karen would regret her victory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would install pipes to direct water from the spring to Karen's property as demanded, but I would design the system to maximize water flow rather than control it. The pipes would be positioned to ensure that during heavy rain or spring thaw, when the water level naturally rose, the excess would flow directly toward the foundation of Karen's house rather than being diverted safely away. Best of all, this design would be fully documented and submitted to the HOA for approval, making Karen complicit in her own future problem. On Monday morning, I submitted detailed plans to the HOA board for the water redistribution project as instructed. The drawing showed a professional-looking piping system with appropriate landscaping to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. What wasn't obvious, unless you understood hydraulics, was how the system would actually function during periods of high water volume. I included all the technical specifications and even added a note thanking the board for their guidance on this community improvement project. Now I just had to wait for Karen to take the bait. Given her eagerness to get the water feature installed before the neighborhood summer party, an event she had mentioned repeatedly at the HOA meeting, I suspected she wouldn't scrutinize the plans too carefully. My prediction proved correct. Just 3 days later, I received an email from the HOA board, clearly written by Karen, though sent from the official board address, approving my submitted plans and expressing appreciation for my newfound spirit of cooperation. The email indicated that I was free to begin installation immediately and requested completion within 2 weeks to ensure the community enhancement is ready for season. I forwarded the approval to my contractor friend, who had agreed to help implement the project in exchange for what he called the satisfaction of seeing justice served, and a generous payment for his expertise, of course. Work began the following Monday. Karen made a point of stopping by multiple times during the installation, offering unsolicited suggestions and barely concealing her triumph. "This is going to be such an improvement for the neighborhood, Sebastian," she gushed during one visit, watching as workers laid the large diameter pipes I had specified. "My landscape designer is already selecting the perfect water plants for the garden. You'll have to come to our summer soiree to see the finished product." Her condescension was difficult to endure, but I maintained a neutral expression. "I'm sure it will be impressive," I replied evenly. "I've made sure the water flow will be substantial." Over the next 10 days, the system took shape exactly as planned. The spring water was now directed into a subsurface pipe system that carried it to the edge of my property, where it connected to a similar system Karen had installed on her side of the property line. The visible portions were tastefully landscaped, with natural stone hiding the transition points between property. To casual observation, it appeared to be a professional water feature installation, with the spring water now emerging in Karen's elaborately designed garden area near her front yard. She had spent a small fortune on exotic plants, decorative rocks, and a small footbridge that arched over what was currently a modest stream. The final component of my plan was installed on the last day, a barely noticeable flow control system on my property that could be adjusted to increase or decrease the water volume. We set it to a normal flow rate initially, enough to feed Karen's decorative stream without causing any issues. The system was designed so that this control could be gradually adjusted over time without obvious tampering. My contractor friend tested everything, gave me a knowing wink, and pronounced the project complete. "Everything's installed according to the approved plans," he confirmed loudly when Karen came over to inspect the finished work. "The water is now flowing unimpeded to the community enhancement area, exactly as specified in the HOA directive." Karen beamed with satisfaction as she watched the water bubbling cheerfully through her new garden. "It looks wonderful. The neighborhood association would like to feature this project in our quarterly newsletter. I'll send a photographer next week." She practically glowed with self-importance, already envisioning the admiration she would receive for her water feature. If only she knew what was coming. As she left, practically skipping with delight, my contractor muttered under his breath, "The best part is she paid for half of her own disaster. Those fancy water plants she bought, they're not going to survive what's coming." I smiled, watching Karen retreat to her house where she could admire the new garden from her front window. "Now we wait for the right moment," I said quietly. According to the weather forecast, we were due for heavy spring rains in about 2 weeks, just after Karen's big summer kickoff party where she planned to unveil her magnificent water garden to the neighborhood elite. Perfect timing for a practical demonstration of why you shouldn't covet your neighbor's water rights. The spring gurgled happily in its new channel, seemingly eager to show Karen exactly what unimpeded water flow really meant. Karen wasted no time showcasing her new water feature. Within days of the installation's completion, she hosted what she called a garden preview for select neighbors, mostly HOA board members and her inner circle of admirers. From my kitchen window, I could see them gathered around the stream, sipping champagne and nodding appreciatively as Karen gestured dramatically, no doubt taking full credit for the neighborhood improvement. She had already added decorative lighting that illuminated the water at night and installed a small bench where she could sit and enjoy her achievement. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was essentially celebrating theft, but I maintained my patience. Nature would deliver justice soon enough. For the next week, I watched as landscapers came and went from Karen's property, adding finishing touches to the water garden. Exotic plants appeared along the stream banks, carefully arranged rocks created artificial cascades, and delicate Japanese maples were positioned for maximum visual impact. An elaborate koi pond had been dug at the lowest point of the garden, stocked with expensive ornamental fish that flashed orange and white in the sunlight. Karen spared no expense, clearly intending this to be the crowning achievement of her HOA presidency. Each addition made me wince internally, knowing it would all be undermined by the very water she had coveted. 10 days after the installation was complete, Karen hand-delivered gilded invitations throughout the neighborhood for her summer solstice soiree, an elaborate garden party centered around the unveiling of the Whispering Pines Community Water Garden. My invitation arrived with a handwritten note. "Sebastian, I hope you'll join us to celebrate this wonderful addition to our neighborhood. Your cooperation made this possible." The saccharine fake graciousness made my stomach turn, but I RSVP'd with a polite acceptance. I wanted to witness firsthand the beginning of Karen's reckoning. The evening before Karen's big party, I checked the weather forecast one last time. A major storm system was indeed moving toward our area, expected to arrive the following evening, likely just as Karen's party would be winding down. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if I'd planned it myself. That night, I made the first small adjustment to the flow control system, increasing the water volume by about 20%. It wasn't enough to cause immediate problems, but it would ensure the ground around Karen's garden was thoroughly saturated before the rains came. Karen's party was everything she had hoped for at first. Dozens of neighbors wandered through her immaculate garden, admiring the burbling stream and colorful koi. A string quartet played classical music on her patio, servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and Karen held court by the footbridge, accepting compliments with false modesty. It was such a vision to see the potential of redirecting that hidden water source. I overheard her telling a group of impressed guests, "Some people just don't understand the concept of community enhancement." She shot me a smug glance across the garden, clearly enjoying her perceived victory. I maintained a pleasant demeanor throughout the evening, sipping champagne and making polite conversation. Several neighbors approached me privately with variations of, "I can't believe you let her take your spring," to which I simply responded, "Sometimes you have to choose your battles." As the party progressed, I noticed a subtle change in the stream. It was flowing slightly faster, the water level incrementally higher than it had been earlier in the day. The storm was still hours away, but the groundwater was already responding to distant rainfall upstream. Karen, caught up in her triumph, didn't notice this warning sign. As twilight fell, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. The party was scheduled to continue well into the evening, with the decorative lighting creating a magical atmosphere as darkness descended. Karen clinked her glass for attention and launched into a self-congratulatory speech about her vision for neighborhood aesthetics and how the water garden exemplified the community spirit of Whispering Pines. As she spoke, a cool breeze picked up, causing some guests to reach for wraps and jackets. "We may see some light showers later," Karen acknowledged with a dismissive wave, "but don't worry, this garden is designed to handle a little rain." If only she knew. I excused myself from the party just as the first raindrops began to fall, citing an early morning meeting the next day. As I walked home, the wind was picking up considerably, and the distant rumble of thunder suggested this was going to be much more than the light shower Karen had dismissed. Once home, I poured myself a scotch and settled in my study with a good book, occasionally glancing out the window as the storm intensified. By midnight, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the roof and windows. I allowed myself a small smile. Phase 1 of Karen's education was about to begin. I woke early the next morning, the storm having passed through overnight, leaving everything drenched. After making coffee, I casually strolled down the street toward Karen's house as if taking a morning walk. What I saw exceeded even my expectations. Karen's meticulously crafted water garden had transformed overnight into something resembling whitewater rapids. The stream had overflowed its carefully constructed banks, washing away much of the decorative gravel and smaller plants. The formerly picturesque footbridge now spanned what looked like a small river, its support posts visibly straining against the current. Most satisfying of all, a significant pool of water had formed along the side of Karen's house, nearest to the garden, lapping against her foundation. Karen stood in her driveway in a bathrobe and rubber boots, frantically speaking with a contractor who was shaking his head as she gestured toward the flooded garden. Her perfect coif was gone, replaced by a frazzled mess that matched her panicked expression. I nodded politely as I passed, calling out a concerned, "Everything okay, Karen? Quite a storm we had." The look she gave me could have curdled milk. "The drainage system isn't working properly," she snapped. "The garden wasn't designed to handle this much water." I adopted an expression of innocent concern. "That's strange. The spring has always increased its flow after heavy rains. Didn't the landscapers account for that?" The confusion and dawning horror on Karen's face was priceless. She clearly hadn't considered the natural variations in the spring's flow when she'd coveted it for her garden. As realization set in, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You knew this would happen," she accused, pointing a trembling finger at me. I maintained my innocent expression. "I assumed the professionals you hired would have researched typical spring behavior before designing the garden. I'm sorry if they didn't mention that natural springs tend to swell after rainfall. That's just how hydrology works." With a friendly wave, I continued my morning walk, leaving Karen to contemplate the first lesson in water rights education. Nature doesn't care about your landscaping plans. The damage from the first major rainfall was just the beginning of Karen's problems. The once pristine garden had transformed into a muddy mess, with water persistently seeping along her house foundation. Through neighborhood gossip, I learned that Karen had shifted from boasting about her garden to demanding emergency HOA funds for infrastructure improvements, but the board was increasingly reluctant to pour more money into what one member privately called Karen's folly. About a month after the initial flooding, I caught two men examining the spring's source on my property. They fled when they saw me, but I recognized one as Karen's regular contractor. That evening, I installed motion-activated cameras overlooking the spring, a precaution that proved wise. Around 2 a.m., my phone alerted me to movement, and the footage showed 3 figures attempting to block the spring with sandbags and quick-setting concrete. I immediately called the police to report the trespassing and vandalism. Though the culprits fled before officers arrived, they left behind damning evidence, materials labeled with Karen's landscaping company's name and their company truck parked nearby. The officers documented everything and advised me to pursue both criminal and civil action. The next morning, I obtained copies of the police report and filed a formal complaint with the County Water Authority, as tampering with a natural water source violated environmental regulations. My attorney drafted a strongly worded letter to both Karen and the HOA board, outlining the legal consequences of the attempted vandalism. Within hours, Gerald Walsh, the HOA vice president, called me. "Sebastian, I want to assure you that if Karen was involved, she was acting without board knowledge or approval," he said nervously. "We're calling an emergency meeting tomorrow to discuss this. We'd appreciate your attendance." The unified HOA front was finally cracking. At the emergency meeting, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Karen sat stiffly to one side, her supporters noticeably distancing themselves. When my turn came to speak, I presented my evidence methodically and stated my conditions: written acknowledgement of my water rights, restoration of the spring to its natural course, and repairs to my property at HOA expense. These terms are non-negotiable if the HOA wishes to avoid being named in the pending legal actions, I concluded. Gerald responded that while they needed to consult their attorney, my requests seemed reasonable given the circumstances. Karen erupted, her composure completely abandoned. "This is absurd. He manipulated the situation from the beginning." Gerald quickly shut her down. "Karen, Given the evidence and potential legal exposure, I suggest we focus on resolution rather than recrimination." As the meeting ended with tentative agreement to my terms, Karen hissed at me. "This isn't over, Sebastian." But the desperation in her eyes told me she knew she was losing. For the first time since this conflict began, victory was clearly within my grasp. The day after the emergency meeting, I received formal confirmation that the HOA accepted my terms. The letter specifically noted that certain board members acted without full authorization, a clear reference to Karen. The very next morning, an aggressive knock came at my door. Karen stood on my porch, her usually immaculate appearance notably disheveled, with water stains visible on her clothes. "We need to talk, Sebastian, privately," she demanded. I led her to my kitchen, where she refused my offer of coffee and launched into her rehearsed speech. "This situation has gotten completely out of control. My home has suffered significant damage, and I'm facing legal action because some contractors took matters into their own hands without my approval." The denial of responsibility was bold even for Karen. "You engineered this disaster," she accused. "The water system you designed deliberately directed excess flow toward my foundation. No professional would have created such a flawed design unless instructed to do so." I calmly retrieved the folder containing the complete design plans bearing her signature. "These plans clearly detail the drainage system and flow rates. If you didn't understand the technical aspects before approving them, that's hardly my responsibility." Karen's composure shattered as she realized she'd been outmaneuvered. "You smug bastard. My basement is taking on water, the foundation is compromised, and my insurance is calling it a pre-existing water issue," she shouted. "You're going to fix this and pay for the repairs." When she threatened to make my life in the neighborhood impossible, I simply produced the police report and security footage showing her contractors vandalizing my property. The color drained from her face. "What do you want?" she asked flatly, defeat evident in her voice. "I want exactly what I've wanted from the beginning, to be left alone to enjoy my property in peace," I replied. "In return, I won't press charges against you personally, provided there are no further incidents." After a long silence, Karen gave a curt nod. "Fine, the water was more trouble than it was worth anyway." As she left, she couldn't resist a final barb about neighborhood standards and community values. I responded simply, "Community values don't include stealing your neighbor's property, Karen. Perhaps if you'd focused on being a good neighbor rather than a controlling one, none of this would have happened." She flinched and hurried away. The spring burbled peacefully in the morning sunlight, soon to be restored to its rightful course. Justice, like water, had found its natural path. The weeks following Karen's reluctant surrender brought a flurry of activity to our normally quiet street. Contractors arrived to dismantle the elaborate piping system that had redirected my spring, carefully removing sections to minimize disruption to either property. Neighbors watched with undisguised curiosity as Karen's once showcase garden was systematically dismantled, the expensive ornamental plants either relocated or discarded as the terrain was restored to its previous contour. Through it all, Karen remained conspicuously absent, leaving for work early each morning and returning after dark, avoiding the spectacle of her defeat. The water damage to her home proved more extensive than initially apparent. Once the decorative facade of river rocks and landscaping was removed from along her foundation, dark stains and visible cracks told the story of water's patient, persistent force. I overheard one contractor telling another that the repair costs would likely exceed $40,000, far more than the HOA had agreed to cover in their settlement. Karen would bear the remainder of that financial burden herself, a fitting consequence for her attempt to appropriate what wasn't hers. I took no pleasure in her misfortune, but I couldn't deny a sense of cosmic justice in the outcome. 2 weeks into the restoration process, I received an unexpected visit from Gerald Walsh, the HOA vice president who had effectively taken over Karen's duties. He stood awkwardly on my porch, clearly uncomfortable but determined to fulfill whatever obligation had brought him here. Sebastian, I wanted to personally deliver this and apologize on behalf of the board for the entire unfortunate situation. He handed me an official envelope bearing the HOA letterhead. Inside was a formal statement acknowledging my exclusive rights to the spring on my property, explicitly exempting it from any future HOA aesthetic regulations or community enhancement initiatives. It was, in essence, a permanent hands-off promise from an organization not known for limiting its own authority. The board has also voted to revise our bylaws, Gerald continued, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. Future projects affecting individual properties will require documented consent from the homeowner, not just board approval. And we've implemented a new requirement for independent technical review of any projects involving water features or structural modifications. He cleared his throat before adding, Karen submitted her resignation from the board yesterday, effective immediately. This last piece of information was delivered with poorly concealed relief. I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression despite my satisfaction at this news. That sounds like positive progress for the neighborhood, Gerald. I appreciate you keeping me informed. After Gerald left, I walked through my backyard to inspect the restoration work. The spring was gradually returning to its natural course, the water clear and bubbling cheerfully over stones as it had before Karen's intervention. The landscape still showed signs of disruption, bare earth where pipes had been removed, newly planted grass that hadn't yet established itself. But nature would heal these wounds quickly. Water knows how to find its proper path, and soon the spring would look as if it had never been diverted at all. I found myself smiling as I watched a pair of finches darting down to drink from the stream, returning to a habitat that had been temporarily stolen from them as well. Over the next month, life in Whispering Pines gradually returned to normal, or rather, established a new normal. Karen's influence had diminished dramatically, her once frequent neighborhood emails and impromptu HOA announcements replaced by communications from Gerald that were notably less dictatorial in tone. The summer block party, typically hosted in Karen's immaculate backyard, was relocated to the community park. Most telling of all, when the Andersons painted their shed a shade of blue not strictly compliant with HOA color guidelines, no violation notice appeared on their door. The neighborhood seemed to collectively exhale, relieved to be freed from Karen's reign of aesthetic terror. Karen herself became a neighborhood ghost, rarely seen outside her home as repairs continued. Rumors circulated that she was planning to sell once the foundation issues were resolved, though no for sale sign had yet appeared. I occasionally glimpsed her through her kitchen window as I walked past, her expression somber as she surveyed her diminished domain. Despite everything, I found myself feeling a twinge of sympathy for her. Pride and the need for control had cost her dearly, not just financially, but in reputation and community standing. Some lessons come at a painfully high price. 6 months after the spring returned to its natural course, I decided to make some enhancements of my own to the backyard water feature. Unlike Karen's ostentatious display, I opted for subtle improvements that worked with nature rather than attempting to dominate it. Stone steps leading down to the water's edge, native plants that thrived in the moist environment, and a simple bench where I could sit and enjoy the peaceful sound of flowing water. It became my favorite spot to unwind after work, watching the play of light on water as the sun set behind the trees. One evening as I sat by the spring with a glass of wine, I noticed movement at the edge of my property. Karen stood there watching from a distance, her expression unreadable in the fading light. For a moment our eyes met, and I braced myself for renewed hostility. Instead, she gave a small, tight nod, not quite an apology, but perhaps an acknowledgement of sorts. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing behind the hedge that separated our property. It was the closest thing to concession I would ever receive from her, and somehow it was enough. 3 weeks later, the for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's house. Within days, I received an unexpected email from my next-door neighbor, Tom. Thought you'd want to know. Karen told the realtor to disclose all foundation repairs and specifically mentioned that the neighboring property has water rights to the natural spring. Guess she learned something after all. I smiled as I read this final chapter in our water rights saga. Karen had indeed learned a valuable lesson, though not the one she'd expected when she first coveted my spring. As for me, I gained something unexpected from the conflict as well. The neighborhood dynamics had shifted, with many neighbors now stopping to chat when they passed by, some even expressing belated support for my stand against Karen's overreach. The spring that had once been my private retreat became an occasional gathering spot where neighbors would pause during evening walks, children would watch for frogs and minnows, and conversations would flow as naturally as the water itself. In fighting to preserve my private water rights, I had inadvertently created something that genuinely benefited the community, not through forced redistribution, but through natural sharing. The following spring, exactly 1 year after the HOA showdown, I hosted a casual neighborhood barbecue in my backyard. As children splashed at the edge of the stream and adults chatted on the patio, Gerald raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To good neighbors and natural boundaries," he said with a knowing smile. I clinked my glass against his, watching the afternoon sun sparkle on the water that had caused so much conflict and ultimately brought unexpected resolution. Karen's house stood empty across the way, awaiting new owners who would hopefully understand that in matters of both water and community, force accomplishes far less than respect. So if you ever find yourself facing a Karen who believes her position of authority entitles her to what's rightfully yours, remember my story. Stand your ground, know your rights, and if necessary, give them exactly what they demanded, along with all the unintended consequences that come with it. Sometimes, the most satisfying victory isn't won through confrontation, but through malicious compliance and letting nature take its course. After all, water always finds its way home eventually, sometimes right through your opponent's living room floor. I'd love to hear your stories of neighborhood Karens and how you handled them. Drop them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of suburban justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of everyday revenge served deliciously cold.